Elves, dwarves, orcs, humans. You already know every Warhammer 40,000 faction. You just don't know it yet. Warhammer 40k has a reputation as the most impenetrable lore in modern gaming. 20 major factions, a galaxy-spanning war set in what the current timeline calls the 42nd Millennium, an entry cost that seems to require a doctoral thesis in fictional theology before you're allowed to understand who's shooting at whom. Newcomers get handed a 300-page codex and told good luck. Here's the decoder nobody gives you at the door. Every major faction in this franchise maps directly onto a fantasy archetype you already know from Tolkien, D&D, or 20 years of video games. Power armor is plate armor. Psychic powers are magic. Ancient alien civilizations are fantasy kingdoms given better spaceships and considerably worse luck. Once you see the pattern, the whole franchise cracks open like something that was waiting to be cracked. Then, once the template is established, the handful of factions that don't map to anything in fantasy become genuinely exciting. Those are the ones 40k needed science fiction to produce. 2 beats, start to finish. Start with the clearest case in the franchise, the Asuryani, known to most people as the craft world Eldar. These are the High Elves, ancient civilization, once the most advanced species in the galaxy by a significant margin, long-lived to the point of near immortality, psychically gifted to a degree no other race approaches, and so extraordinarily arrogant that their arrogance literally ended them. Not through war, not through conquest, but through pure, sustained excess. The Eldari built an empire spanning star systems. At its height, they wielded Wraithbone, a psycho-reactive material only they could shape and bond with, used to construct everything from their warships to their weapons to the semi-organic walls of their craft worlds. It responds to Eldari psychic energy, growing and reshaping under trained hands, as close to living architecture as any species has produced. They had access to the webway, a network of subdimensional passages threading between the warp and real space, letting them move across the galaxy faster and more safely than anyone else. Their technology was indistinguishable from sorcery to every other species they encountered. They knew it. They loved knowing it. Then the bill arrived. The Eldari's collective indulgence across thousands of years, the obsession with sensation, with excess, with pleasures that escalated into something beyond categorization, generated a psychic resonance in the warp, the immaterial dimension that underlies real space. That resonance grew, condensed, achieved consciousness. What was born from the psychic aftershock of their civilization was Slaanesh, she who thirsts, a chaos god shaped specifically from Eldari hedonism, hungry specifically for Eldari souls. The birth event, called the Fall, tore the Eldari Empire apart in a single catastrophic moment and consumed most of their species. An empire that once numbered in the trillions became a scattered remnant. The survivors fled on craft worlds, planetoid-sized spacecraft, each carrying the culture of a different Eldari community, drifting through the void at sublight speeds indefinitely. Ulthwé, Eondon, Saim Han, Biel-Tan. Each craft world operates as its own independent city-state, distinct in culture, military doctrine, and relationship to the wider galaxy. The Codex acknowledges the demographic reality without softening it. There simply aren't enough Asuryani left. Every surviving soul is permanently at risk. Slaanesh hungers specifically for Eldari spirits. An Asuryani who dies without their soul captured in a soulstone is immediately consumed. So they follow rigid spiritual disciplines called the Path of the Eldar, structured life practices designed to keep emotional intensity contained and controlled. Because emotional excess is precisely what summoned the god that now wants to eat them. Warriors follow the Path of the Warrior, training at specific aspect shrines dedicated to the war facets of their ancient deity Cain. Seers follow the Path of the Seer, developing psychic abilities to guide their people while balancing the constant risk of going too deep into the warp. A warrior who can't complete their path and return, consumed entirely by a single role, becomes an exarch, permanently locked into their martial identity, unable to leave the shrine, serving it until they die. The dead, meanwhile, don't simply rest. Asuryani killed in battle can have their soul gem bonded into wraithbone constructs, Wraith Lords and Wraithguard, tall, silent figures piloted from inside by the spirits of the deceased, guided back to service by specialists called Spirit Seers. An Eldari army can include its honored dead walking alongside the living, because the living need them and the dead have nowhere else to be. Tolkien's elves boarding ships at the Grey Havens because their time in Middle-earth is ending. Ancient, diminishing, still extraordinary, still unbearably arrogant about the age they destroyed. Just with significantly more weapons, a specific god whose diet is their species, and their ancestors available as emergency infantry. Each craft world has its own sub-factions, distinct cultures, and centuries of separate history. The archetype is what matters here. Ancient, magnificent, dwindling, haunted, exiled on ships too vast to be called ships. If the craft world Asuryani are the High Elves, the Drukhari are the Dark Elves, and the parallel is uncomfortably direct. When the fall tore the Eldari Empire apart, a faction had already retreated into a hidden realm inside the webway called Kamara, the Dark City. Insulated from Slaaneish's birth scream by layers of subdimensional space, they survived. Survival came with a complication. Even in Kamara, Slaanesh could slowly drain their souls across centuries. The Drukhari found a solution. By feeding on the suffering of others, the intense psychic resonance generated by pain and terror in sentient beings, they could sustain themselves, pushing Slaanesh back. So they became raiders, pirates, slavers who strike real space in silent surgical attacks, kidnap entire populations, drag captives back to the Dark City, and extract every possible unit of agony before their victims expire. Their immortality is a maintenance schedule. The moment they stop raiding, they start dying. Their internal society reflects this economy in every detail. Cabals are the great noble houses of the Dark City, military organizations commanded by archons who maintain their position by being more dangerous than everyone immediately below them, which keeps succession active and continuous. Witch cults provide the arena fighters who perform public spectacle in the gladiatorial pits, entertainment and soul feed simultaneously. Homunculi covens are the flesh crafters, surgeons and scientists who have extended their own lives so far beyond any normal range that mortality itself has become a philosophical curiosity to them, practicing body modification and biological experimentation as both art form and commercial service. Their clients include every major faction in the city. Everyone needs something from the homunculi eventually. Kamora itself exists inside the webway, invisible on Imperium star charts because it has no real space coordinates, growing through conquest and construction across millennia until it exceeds most planets in sheer extent. Its ruling archon coined the name Dark Eldar as a deliberate act of self-definition, claiming the label rather than being assigned it. Sadistic, underground, morally inverted cousins of the graceful craft world kin. The High Elf/Dark Elf split is one of the most repeated structures in fantasy. Games Workshop transposed it onto a fallen alien civilization and made the underground variant's moral inversion mechanically necessary for survival rather than a simple villainous choice. The Drukhari aren't doing this because they chose it freely. The fall left them with a metabolism that requires it. The third elf variant is the one most lore channels skip entirely. Exodites are the wood elves of Warhammer 40k, and they represent one of the stranger decisions in the franchise's lore history. A fully established canonical faction with genuine narrative depth, no complete codex army of their own, and a design philosophy completely at odds with every other Eldar branch. Before the fall destroyed the Eldari Empire, some among them looked at the trajectory of their civilization and left, not for craft worlds drifting in the void, but for uninhabited worlds they could settle as something close to tribal societies. Deliberately low technology, deliberately separate from the excess consuming their people. They bonded with their new worlds through something called the world spirit, a psychic entity inhabiting the ecosystem of each exodite planet, connecting the settlers to their living environment at a fundamental level. Gav Thorpe, longtime Black Library author, confirmed this directly in a community Q&A on exodite lore. The world spirit has emotions, has desires, has a form of genuine consciousness. And they brought dinosaurs. Not because the worlds they settled happened to have them. They transported the creatures deliberately, using them as a form of active terraforming. Vast reptilian animals bred and bonded across generations, used as cavalry mounts, beasts of burden, and living siege assets in the low-tech warfare exodites engage in when their worlds are threatened. High-technology aliens choosing a primitive feudal existence by deliberate rejection of their own civilization, psychically bonded to living worlds, fighting on the backs of carnivorous prehistoric lizards. 3 versions of the same base species distributed across a galaxy. The graceful, diminishing remnant on craft worlds, watching their numbers decline, one soul at a time. The sadistic, underground raiders, sustaining themselves on stolen suffering in their hidden city. And the nature-attuned settlers, bonded to living planets and mounted on things that have no business being cavalry. The complete elf taxonomy, every variant the genre has ever produced, mapped onto one alien race. The exodites are the piece that reveals how deliberately the whole construction was assembled. The orcs are exactly what they look like on the surface, and then the 40K version starts running something much stranger underneath. At baseline, green, violent, tribal, organized around the principle that the biggest and most dangerous individual leads. Their hierarchy is legible at a glance. At the bottom sit Gretchen, small, cowardly, useful primarily as cannon loaders, meat shields, and general-purpose expendables. Above them, the core orc boys who form the backbone of every Wa. Above them, knobs, larger, better equipped, fiercely competitive about rank. At the top, the war boss, who holds authority because he could kill every orc beneath him and has probably already tested the proposition multiple times. Their entire civilization is oriented toward finding the next war, and a galaxy with perpetual interstellar conflict suits them perfectly. Classic fantasy orc archetype, completely at home in the setting. Then the specific 40K mechanics arrive. Orcs reproduce through spores. Community lore broadly establishes their biology as self-seeding, releasing reproductive material upon death. A world that once hosted an orc infestation can't be permanently cleared. The Departamento Munitorum maintains operational divisions specifically for monitoring post-battle worlds for orc regrowth. Kill them all. Come back a generation later. Find orcs. Among orc specialists, mech boys occupy the engineering role, somewhere between a blacksmith and a shaman, assembling weapons and vehicles from scrap metal with no engineering theory that any non-orc could identify, producing results that somehow function. Weird boys are the orc equivalent of psychers, conduits for the Wa energy field, who channel more power than the average orc generates individually, typically against their own preferences, given that the outcomes are unpredictable and frequently violent in the wrong direction. All orcs collectively generate something called the Wa, Codex confirmed as a gestalt psychic energy that grows stronger as more orcs congregate and fight together. In 9th edition rules, a Wa declaration gives every orc in the warband increased strength, increased attacks, the ability to advance and charge in the same turn, and a 5-up invulnerable save. Measurable, numerical, in-game mechanical effects. What that field does in lore beyond the rules is where things get genuinely contested, and this is worth being precise about, because the 40K audience will identify and punish speculation presented as Codex canon. The beloved interpretation, widely cited across decades of lore discussion, present in the franchise's narrative as established flavor, runs like this. The Wa makes orc belief partially real. Red vehicles go faster because orcs believe they do. Yellow explosives produce bigger detonations. Their ramshackle guns, assembled from scrap by creatures whose engineering philosophy amounts to hitting things until they work, function because the collective psychic field of thousands of orcs believing they'll work provides enough ambient reality pressure to make them function. It's in the lore as narrative color. It apparently reflected an actual rules mechanic in earlier editions of the game. One well-known community video is titled precisely along the lines of "Orc belief does not work that way," which signals both how widely the interpretation is held and how actively it's debated. The honest position? The WA is real and codex confirmed, with defined numerical effects. The belief makes things real extension is the franchise's most endearing interpretive ambiguity and the best-running joke in tabletop gaming, present in the lore, contested in scope, and impossible to entirely disprove, which is probably how Games Workshop prefers it. Reportedly, the orcs were created by an ancient race called the Old Ones as purpose-built weapons of war, engineered for violence and self-reproduction. Their creators lost control of history before the design included any mechanism for deactivation, and the orcs have been fighting everything, including each other, ever since, needing no further instruction. Orcs in space, psychically overclocked, self-seeding, possibly reshaping reality through collective conviction, and biologically impossible to fully exterminate. The fantasy archetype is the surface. The engine underneath is something medieval settings couldn't have produced. Nobody tells newcomers about the dwarves. Specifically, nobody tells them that Games Workshop spent years claiming the dwarves were dead, consumed by the Tyranids, gone, forget about them, and then brought them back with a lore rework so substantial that the returning version is a genuinely more interesting science fiction faction than what preceded it. The original faction was called the Squats. They existed from the very first edition of the game in 1987, stocky, heavily built, technology-obsessed, stubbornly independent miners and engineers operating from vast underground homeworlds. Space dwarves. They had a full model range through the game's early years, prominent in the original Rogue Trader release, then began shrinking with the 1991 catalog and eventually stopped receiving meaningful support entirely. The in-universe explanation, and this tells you something about Games Workshop's relationship with its own history, was that the Tyranids arrived at Squat Space and consumed the entire civilization before anyone could organize a defense. No survivors, no refugees, no remnants, just gone. For years, the Squats were the community's running joke. Whenever a faction received poor support or a model range disappeared quietly, the community said it had been eaten by Tyranids. The Squats made that metaphor literal and personal. Then, after an absence spanning decades, Games Workshop announced the Leagues of Votann. The official announcement article arrived with remarkable confidence in its title. The Leagues of Votann are coming. But what actually is a Votann? The answer, confirmed in their codex lore, a Votann is an ancestor core. And the ancestor cores are where this faction stops being space dwarves and becomes something genuinely science-fictional. The kin. Squat, powerfully built abhuman clones who form the Leagues of Votann, organize themselves into industrial confederations called leagues. They mine, they engineer, they fight, with the contained precision of people who calculate appropriate responses to every slight across generational timescales and never forget an entry in the ledger. Classic dwarf DNA, completely intact. The ancestor cores are vast, ancient machine intelligences, computational constructs of extraordinary sophistication, each encoding the accumulated knowledge, cultural memory, and ongoing analytical capacity of a league across centuries. They aren't archives. They think. They form plans. They hold preferences. They have been running, updating, and processing information for longer than most Imperium worlds have had settled populations. When a kin commander asks the ancestors for guidance before battle, something answers, and the answer reflects a mind that has been considering strategic options since before anyone in the room was born. The dwarves of fantasy consult their ancestors through ritual and memory. The leagues of Votan consult theirs through a query sent to a machine intelligence that never stopped thinking. Same archetype, entirely science-fictional execution. The faction erased from the setting for decades came back as something far stranger and more interesting than what the Tyranids ate. Space Marines barely need the full treatment because you already half know them, but snapping the archetype into place precisely is worth a moment. Power armor is plate armor. The heraldic shoulder guards are shields. Each chapter is a knightly order. The Ultramarines operating on Roman discipline and the Codex Astartes, the manual of war written by their Primarch Robute Guilliman that defines correct chapter organization and conduct across most of the Space Marine fraternity. The Blood Angels carrying an inherited genetic flaw called the Black Rage, a recurring psychic echo of their Primarch's death that the most affected fall into permanently. The Dark Angels concealing something from the Horus heresy that the chapter has never disclosed to the wider Imperium, pursuing their secret with a paranoid intensity that other factions have noticed and found deeply suspicious. Each chapter carries its own heraldry, its own centuries of wars fought in the Emperor's name, its own fortress monastery that functions exactly as a fortified keep scaled up tenfold and fitted with orbital defense installations. The creation process is the 40K specificity. Each Space Marine is drawn from humanity as a teenager, surgically modified with 19 distinct genetic implants, a secondary heart, a reinforced skeleton, a Becher's gland that allows production of acidic compounds, an homophagia that extracts impressions from consumed biological tissue, including the memories encoded within it, and trained for years before being considered combat-ready. The finished product stands approximately 8 feet tall, processes battlefield information at speeds that make unmodified humans look stationary, and swears lifelong service to a chapter and to an emperor most of them will never meet in person. Each chapter fields approximately 1,000 battle brothers, organized into 10 companies. Roughly 1,000 chapters exist across the Imperium, which sounds like a large number until you account for the scale of the threats they're deployed against simultaneously and realize every single one of them is needed in multiple places at once. The Emperor himself, according to the setting's own timeline, was born in ancient Anatolia approximately 8000 BCE, an immortal who guided human civilization for the shadows for 10 millennia before making himself publicly known. He currently sits on the Golden Throne, technically alive and technically not, keeping the galaxy's psychic navigation network operational through sustained dying. The throne is reportedly failing. The entire Imperium's interstellar travel infrastructure runs on his continued not-quite death. Knightly orders sworn to a god king on a failing throne. Pure archetype. The 40K version just committed harder to the premise than the fantasy original ever did. Behind every knight army is a vast, expendable infantry, and the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, are the peasant levy of the far future. Billions of ordinary humans raised from worlds across the Imperium through a tithe system, issued standard equipment, organized into regiments, and deployed to every war the Space Marines can't reach simultaneously, which is most wars. Space Marines number in the thousands per chapter. The Astra Militarum operates in numbers so vast that individual regiment casualties register as rounding errors in campaign assessments. They win through mass because mass is what they have. The tithe system works like this. Each planetary governor owes the Imperium a periodic levy of soldiers, materiel, and resources. Quantity varies by world, calculated against population, industrial output, and strategic location. A hive world with a population in the billions might tithe multiple full regiments annually. An agri-world, barely meeting subsistence output, might tithe a single company every decade. The regiments ship out, typically never return to their home world, and serve wherever the Departamento Munitorum calculates they're needed until attrition reduces them below functional strength. The lasgun's flashlight reputation is funnier than accurate. A lasgun is a reliable, well-engineered directed energy weapon that kills unarmored targets efficiently. The reputation comes from comparing it to a bolter, which fires explosive self-propelled rounds roughly the size of a grown man's finger. Against a bolter, a lasgun is a flashlight. Against most of what exists in the galaxy that isn't wearing power armor or carrying an energy shield, it ends arguments cleanly. The meme holds as a comparison point while slightly misrepresenting the weapon itself. Where the faction earns its genuine depth is regimental diversity. Every regiment is drawn from a different world, carrying its own military tradition, its own culture, its own hard-won adaptations. Cadian soldiers raised from birth in fortress cities on the permanent edge of a chaos incursion, drilling before they can properly walk. Catachan jungle fighters who grow up on a world so hostile that the local flora actively hunts adult humans, arriving at basic training having already survived more genuine combat than most soldiers see in a decade of active service. Armageddon's urban warfare specialists, shaped by two catastrophic orc invasions that reshaped the planet's entire surface and population. Talarn desert raiders whose cavalry feint tactics suit open desert campaigns as well as any doctrine the Munitorum has ever formally codified. Mordian Iron Guard who march to battle in dress uniforms because their doctrine holds that presentation constitutes morale, and their casualty rates suggest they might be correct. The Astra Militarum is less a single army than an anthology of every human military tradition the galaxy has produced, bound into one order of battle. In a setting populated by demigods and ancient alien horrors and machine intelligences, the Imperial Guard are people, ordinary people, given ordinary weapons, asked to show up regardless, because the galaxy requires saving constantly, and being mortal does not qualify as an exemption. Necrons started as one fantasy archetype and evolved into a richer, more layered one, and acknowledging that evolution is part of understanding why the current version works. Original Necrons, the community calls them Oldcrons, were space undead, implacable, mindless, ancient robots rising from tomb worlds after millions of years dormant to kill everything and return to sleep. No personality, no culture, no agenda beyond termination. Pure mechanical undead translated directly into science fiction. It was functional as horror. As a civilization, it had almost nothing. The 5th edition Codex rewrote them substantially. The community debate about which version was better has run for over a decade, with genuine advocates on both sides. What the rewrite added was something the original entirely lacked: a tragedy. The Necrontyr were an organic species who once ruled the galaxy. Their home star irradiated them, giving them short, painful lives spent in perpetual proximity to a sun that was killing them incrementally. Bitter, desperate, they made war on the old ones, the ancient precursor race who had occupied the galaxy's prime real estate for longer than the Necrontyr had existed, and lost. Comprehensively. In that defeat, they found an offer. The Catan were star gods, vast stellar intelligences that fed on the energy of suns, entities whose consciousness spanned the lifetimes of solar systems. They offered the Necrontyr immortality. The process was called biotransference. Each Necrontyr's consciousness was extracted and encoded into an indestructible metal frame while their organic bodies were destroyed. They woke up as Necrons, eternal, undying, and wrong. The transfer stripped most of them of emotional range, ambition, and the capacity for the experiences that had made life worth wanting to extend in the first place. The Catan fed on the soul energy released by 60 million transfers. The Necrontyr had handed their enemy the exact price of their own salvation. The Catan then attempted to direct their new army. The Necrons, in one of the grimmer strategic pivots in the franchise's history, eventually shattered the Catan into fragments and bound those fragments inside containment vessels called Tesseract vaults, keeping the pieces of their former gods as weapons rather than masters. Then they went to sleep for 60 million years. Tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy with resurrection protocols set on timers calibrated to trigger when the galaxy had recovered enough to be worth reclaiming. Now they're waking up. Ancient rulers reforming their courts and dynasties. the Satek dynasty commanding the largest Necron military force currently active, its overlords ranging across dozens of star systems in systematic conquest. Others pursuing more specific agendas, some obsessive, some apparently philosophical. The most powerful retain their personalities through biotransference largely intact. Others exist with only fragments of who they were. A few have developed entirely new identities in the vacuum left by the transfer process. The most thoughtful among them are deeply unhappy about what was done to them. A few find it darkly acceptable. The most ancient have stopped caring about the distinction. Egyptian tomb kings. An organic civilization made a deal with god entities, transformed into undead through a specific documented process, sleeping in elaborate tombs, rising to reclaim their empire. The Satan are the pharaoh gods. The tomb worlds are the pyramids. The interesting Necrons are the mummies who remember precisely what was taken from them. And several have spent 60 million years of recursive metal dreaming, developing very specific feelings about it. 6 fantasy archetypes confirmed. 3 elf variants, orcs running a psychic field, dwarves returned from lore exile, armored knights, cannon fodder infantry, Egyptian undead robots. Everyone wearing a science fiction costume while running a fantasy engine underneath. The 4 factions that genuinely break this pattern are where 40K earns something beyond its influences. The Tau shouldn't exist in this setting. Every other faction in Warhammer 40K is defined by horror at some scale. The Imperium burns its own citizens for impurity at a rate that makes the historical Inquisition look measured. The Eldar are watching their species die in slow motion. The Necrons are 60 million displaced persons locked in metal bodies. Chaos is chaos. Then there are the Tau, a species with a collective political philosophy called the Greater Good, a functioning multi-species alliance built through genuine diplomacy backed by credible military force, a caste system that distributes function clearly across society, and a stated preference for bringing potential enemies into their confederation before defaulting to extermination. They have no fantasy equivalent, and the reason why illuminates what 40K's science fiction framework actually adds. Every fantasy tradition's optimistic, cooperative species is anchored in some form of the supernatural. Nature communion, divine blessing, ancestral power, fate weaving. The Tau have none of it. Their warp presence is confirmed as essentially non-existent. No psychers, no connection to the immaterial dimension, no demons with a claim on their souls. In a setting where the supernatural framework shapes the fate of every other species, where chaos feeds on emotion, where the Eldar maintain their souls in gemstones to prevent divine consumption, where even the dead refuse to fully depart, the Tau simply don't register on that frequency. Chaos gods feed on emotion, but the Tau's minimal warp footprint gives those entities almost no purchase. They exist, materially and completely, in real space. The caste system divides function clearly. Fire caste warriors fight. Earth caste engineers build. Water caste diplomats negotiate. Air caste pilots fly. And the ethereals provide philosophical and political leadership. The precise mechanism by which ethereals maintain authority over the other castes is one of the franchise's running, unresolved questions. Whether it's psychic compulsion, pheromonal influence, or genuine political legitimacy is left deliberately ambiguous across multiple codex editions. Their technology substitutes for the magic every other faction possesses. Battlesuit platforms like the XV8 Crisis Suit let Firecast warriors engage opponents that outmass them significantly. The Greater Good is an active missionary enterprise, not merely an internal philosophy. Tau delegations have formally incorporated multiple alien species into their alliance structure through a combination of negotiation, economic incentive, and, when necessary, demonstrating that resistance is more costly than cooperation. Their expansion method involves sending diplomats before soldiers wherever the strategic situation allows. It doesn't always work. The military follows when it doesn't, but the genuine attempt distinguishes them from essentially every other faction in the setting, most of which treat offer alliance before attacking as a suspicious waste of perfectly good attack time. There's no clean fantasy equivalent for optimistic, technocratic, multi-species confederation conducting active diplomacy before applying force. That concept requires a society advanced enough to institutionalize cooperation across species boundaries as a political program rather than a conquest model. It requires the infrastructure, embassies, translation protocols, interspecies legal frameworks that medieval settings couldn't support at civilizational scale. Fantasy didn't have the vocabulary. 40K has it in the one faction that genuinely feels out of place in its own universe, which makes them fascinating rather than naive. Tyranids required the concept of extragalactic space. Their origin, confirmed in codex sources as extragalactic, meaning they arrived from outside the Milky Way entirely, is the foundation of everything about them. Tyranids travel through the voids between galaxies in vast, drifting hive fleets. Hive Fleet Behemoth struck the eastern fringe from directly above the galactic plane and was turned back at enormous cost. Hive Fleet Kraken dissolved into thousands of splinter fleets simultaneously, overwhelming the response capacity of any single defending force. Hive Fleet Leviathan emerged from below the galactic plane, striking simultaneously at dozens of worlds in a coordinated pattern that suggested strategic planning at a scale no individual mind could coordinate. Each fleet adapted to what it encountered, incorporating useful biological traits from consumed species into new organisms tailored for the next engagement. Where they originally came from, whether they exhausted another galaxy before arriving in this one, whether other fleets are currently crossing the intergalactic void toward other civilizations, none of this is answered. The implication sits in the lore unaddressed, which is more frightening than any answer. The Tyranid hive mind is a single distributed consciousness running simultaneously through every organism in every hive fleet, coordinating billions of creatures across interstellar distances in real time. Individually, a Tyranid organism has no will, no goal, no inner life. It's a neuron in a body the size of a fleet. Collectively, the hive mind has total will, a single goal, and a patience calibrated to geological timescales. The goal is biomass, not territory. Every world a hive fleet reaches is stripped to bedrock, all biological matter broken down, absorbed, and used to generate new organisms carrying useful traits from whatever they just consumed. Conquest implies a purpose after the fighting ends. Digestion doesn't. The shadow in the warp is the first warning, a psychic suppression field projected by any approaching hive fleet, disrupting all warp-based communication and navigation across a wide radius around the incoming fleet. Every psyker-dependent civilization, Space Marine navigators, Eldar seers, Imperial astropaths, goes partially blind when Tyranids arrive. The warp, upon which interstellar travel, psychic power, and Eldari soul protection all depend, becomes hostile static in the presence of a hive fleet. By the time most civilizations understand what's happening, communication has already failed, and the fleet is already in system. Fantasy has monsters. Tolkien's orcs want to conquer. Dragons want to accumulate. Demons want to corrupt. The Tyranids don't want anything in a form that has ever been successfully negotiated with. There is no entity to negotiate with, only a distributed appetite operating on a scale that makes individual planets look like single cells. That concept required science fiction to articulate. Fantasy couldn't produce the necessary scale and couldn't produce the biological precision of a species consuming genetic material specifically for strategic adaptation rather than territory or tribute. The Adeptus Mechanicus needed science fiction for a completely different reason. Their archetype requires transhumanism, a specifically modern philosophical framework, fused with religious fanaticism in a combination medieval settings couldn't have conceived. The tech priests of Mars worship a deity called the Omnissiah, the machine god, whom many among them identify with the emperor, though that theological position carries significant political weight and has never been cleanly resolved to the satisfaction of either party. Their central doctrine, flesh is weak, knowledge is sacred, technology is divine. Proof of devotion is demonstrated by replacing organic body parts with mechanical augmentations. Senior tech priests operate mechadendrites as natural extensions of their bodies, their voices replaced by vox units, their memories stored in external data coils, their original biological form reduced to whatever percentage hasn't yet been replaced. The most senior are barely recognizable as having started human. This is the intended destination, not a side effect of long service. Mars is theirs, genuinely independent from Terra, linked to the wider Imperium not by incorporation, but by a treaty forged in the early years of the Great Crusade. The Emperor needed Martian technological expertise to build his war machine. The Mechanicus needed imperial political authority to protect their independence and their accumulated knowledge. The arrangement has held for 10,000 years on the strength of mutual dependence and mutual distrust in roughly equal measure. Their military forces, the Scutari, warriors augmented far beyond normal human capacity, free will surgically reduced to make them perfectly obedient instruments of the Mechanicus's strategic priorities, prosecute the wars their masters need fought. The arrangement functions well enough that neither side has terminated it, which in the 40K universe qualifies as a genuinely successful long-term partnership. Their knowledge is sacred mystery, information shared only with initiates of appropriate rank, hoarded in the vast industrial cathedral complexes of their forge worlds scattered across the galaxy, treated as property that can be tithed, traded, and strategically withheld from allies who might become competitors. The standard template construct, a pre-fall database representing the complete engineering knowledge of human civilization at its technological height, functions as their holy scripture. A confirmed STC fragment recovers a manufacturing technique lost for 10,000 years and is worth wars. Forge masters have started them over less. Fantasy has monks, artificers, religious orders, and divine craftsmen. It doesn't have an independent theocratic state built around the sacrament of systematically replacing your own body in pursuit of mechanical perfection, simultaneously running the entire engineering infrastructure of the most powerful human empire in history while maintaining sovereign independence from it. Transhumanism requires the concept of achievable augmentation beyond biology's limits. The political structure requires institutional technology dependence at civilizational scale. Both are science fiction prerequisites. The Adeptus Mechanicus is a faction that fantasy simply didn't have the vocabulary to produce. Gene stealer cults are the most conceptually strange faction in the setting, and the strangeness is precise. A single gene stealer, a vanguard tyrannid bioform sent ahead of the main fleets, stows away on a cargo ship or makes planetfall on an inhabited world. It infects a host. The infection produces hybrid offspring carrying tyrannid genetic material in decreasing concentrations across successive generations. First-generation hybrids are obviously alien, recognizably non-human in every physical detail. Second-generation hybrids are less obviously so. Third and fourth generations can pass as human, their alien origin visible only under specific examination. These hybrids don't necessarily understand what they are. They feel an overwhelming instinctive pull toward the cult's patriarch, the original gene stealer, now the living center of the cult's hierarchy, and toward something vast approaching from the deep void. They experience this pull as faith. They build liturgy around it. They call what's coming the Star Father. The cult structure has internal leadership beyond the patriarch. The Magus, typically a psyker of significant capability, serves as the cult's public-facing religious and organizational leader, capable of directing the membership with genuine strategic intelligence. The Primus is the military commander, often a highly modified hybrid, who plans the uprising with tactical sophistication. Aberrants are the uncontrolled variants, hybrids where the genetic blending produced something too physically powerful and too cognitively unstable for standard cult roles. deployed as shock assault units because their combat capability compensates for their inability to wait patiently. The cult infiltrates planetary society across generations. Its members climb into positions in the military, the government, the industrial infrastructure, driven not by conspiracy in the way humans understand it, but by the encoded biological directive of the infection itself. They recruit with genuine religious conviction, because from inside the experience, it's genuine religious conviction. They wait, without fully understanding what they're waiting for, until the hive fleet enters the system. At that moment, every cult cell activates simultaneously. Mass uprising, coordinated across an entire planet, sabotaging defenses from within precisely as the Tyranids hit from without. The planet's resistance collapses. The Tyranids consume everything. The cultists, having served their vanguard function, are consumed along with the rest. The entity they worship eats them. Their religion is a biological invasion mechanism. Their faith was engineered into their genetics before they were born. Their God views them as a delivery system, not a congregation. The patriarch knows this. It's acting on the same hive mind directive as every other Tyranid organism, and its cultists are simply a more efficient method of planetary destabilization than a frontal assault. Fantasy has cults, infiltrators, corruption, and devotion directed at malevolent gods. It doesn't have a multi-generational biological sleeper cell operating as the advanced vanguard of an extragalactic consumption fleet, where the worshippers are the infection vector, their apocalypse is the god's next meal, and the whole mechanism runs automatically across decades without requiring central coordination. Body horror as a concept requires germ theory to fully articulate. The sleeper cell structure requires modern intelligence tradecraft as its conceptual model. The generational patience requires institutional timescales that medieval settings couldn't model. Gene stealer cults are a genuinely science-fictional concept wearing the skin of a horror cult. Chaos doesn't fit the decoder exercise the same way as the others. It's better understood as the corrupted shadow of every archetype that already exists in the setting. The warp is shaped by the collective emotional output of every sentient being in the galaxy. Fear, ambition, despair, violence, excess, all of it bleeds through from real space into the immaterial dimension and takes form. 4 dominant forms have coalesced across millennia of collective suffering into what 40K calls the Chaos Gods. Entities born from the psychic residue of conscious life, representing the worst of what minds produce at sufficient scale. The universe was designed from the beginning as a deliberately exaggerated satire. The original game's creators built it specifically to illustrate how a theocratic dictatorship taken to its logical extreme consumes itself. The Imperium burns its citizens for impurity. The Chaos Gods are fed precisely by the fear and violence that the Imperium's brutality generates. The cycle is self-sustaining by design. Chaos Space Marines are the fallen knights, Space Marine legions that turned traitor during the Horus Heresy and have fought against the Imperium for 10,000 years since, corrupted by service to gods composed entirely of the emotions that the Imperium's methods generate in everyone they touch. Their patron gods map to the complete spectrum of human vice given divine form and cosmological scale. War and bloodshed producing one, scheming and ambition another, decay and inevitability a third, excess and sensation the fourth. Every other faction has a chaos equivalent trying to consume or corrupt it. Deep chaos theology, the warp's internal logic, the demon prince hierarchies, the philosophical architecture of gods made from emotion is its own very long video. What matters here? Corrupted mirrors of every other faction in the setting, perpetually expansive, and arguably the franchise's most honest commentary on itself. For anyone who grew up on StarCraft rather than Tolkien, the decoder works in both directions. Terran humans, outnumbered and technologically outmatched, surviving through organization and mass infantry production, Astra Militarum in real-time strategy form. The Zerg consuming all available biomass through a distributed hive mind arriving from outside known space. Tyranids with a different art department. The Protoss as ancient psychically gifted warriors carrying the weight of a ruined civilization and the arrogance of a species that used to be unstoppable. The Eldar by a different name. Academic comparisons of the two franchises note the parallels as structurally significant. Whether there's a direct design lineage between StarCraft and 40K is a story the internet tells many versions of, none confirmed by a primary source. The parallels exist independent of the question. If StarCraft was your entry point into science fiction, you were already reading 40K without the codex. All of this, the archetypes, the originals, the complete taxonomy of a fictional galaxy, is prologue to the story that defines the current state of every faction in the game. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs, genetically engineered transhuman sons, each commanding a Space Marine Legion and leading the Great Crusade to reunify humanity across a galaxy it had lost for millennia. At the height of that crusade, it was working. Humanity was reclaiming the stars. The Emperor was winning. Then roughly half his sons betrayed him. Led by a war master named Horus, first among the Primarchs, the Emperor's chosen heir, the general who had done more than anyone else to make the Great Crusade succeed, an unknown number of legions turned on everything they had spent decades building together. The civil war that followed ended with the Emperor wounded beyond recovery, interred on the Golden Throne, and the Imperium locked into a 10,000-year holding pattern of slow collapse that defines every faction's current situation in the 42nd millennium. Every war being fought right now is a consequence of what happened then, why they turned, what Horus was promised, what each of the traitor Primarchs chose freely versus what was done to them. Ideology and manipulation and genuine grievance and pride, all compressed into a civil war that lasted years and produced consequences still unfolding 10,000 years later. That is one of the greatest stories in science fiction. It's also a different video. Subscribe for more stories like this.